The sovereigns had fixed on the conditions of the armistice. Every fortress was to be revictualled once in 5 days, and to have a league of ground beyond its lines, but the Duke of Württemberg took it upon himself to elude this engagement. He contested my statement of our positions. He disputed about the limits. After several conferences, we came to a provisional arrangement, and we remitted the question to persons appointed to settle it. Then arose new difficulties. At one time they alleged a want of provisions, at another a lack of conveyance. The allowances, at all times incomplete, were constantly in arrears. At last they were entirely suspended. The Duke stood in need of a pretext. He found one. He pretended that we had broken the truce, because we had done justice on some band of robbers that infested our rear. His letter, which could have been transmitted to me in 2 hours, took 2 days to reach me. So many subterfuges made me indignant. I went straight to the point. I told him that I would have no more tergiversation, and that he must fight or fulfill the conditions stipulated. He replied by talking of the cause of nations and of kings. This language was curious. I expressed to him how much it astonished me, coming from the mouth of a prince whose sovereign had been our ally for 5 years, and whose brother was still fighting for us. This last example touched him a little. He replied peevishly that a Russian general-in-chief did not think himself inferior in any respect to a king of the Confederation, since it only depended on the Emperor Alexander to raise him to that dignity, and that then he might be a king as well as another, that he would, however, only be so under this slight condition that it should not be at the expense of any power or person. The troops ran to arms, but the Duke was unwilling to take the consequences of this rupture. He offered to continue the supplies. They ought to have been sent on the 24th, but they did not come until the 26th, and were never complete. Tainted meat and flour so very bad that we did not venture to make any use of it until we had made experiments on it, were the only provisions that the Russians furnished us with. They were not more faithful as to the quantity. We did not receive above 2/3 of what was guaranteed to us by the treaty. The Prince de Neuchâtel told me that it was necessary to hold out until the month of May following. The thing was quite impossible. I had neither provisions nor troops sufficient for so prolonged a defense. I pointed it out to him. My dispatch was precise. Everything that was possible we were ready to undertake, but good intentions do not create means. Danzig, June 16th, 1813. My Prince, I received the letter which your Highness did me the honor to write from Neumark, dated the 5th of June. Mr. Planet also sent me a collection of monitors containing the details of the decisive battles gained by Napoleon over the combined forces. I had already received, the day before Mr. Planet's arrival, intelligence of the brilliant successes of Napoleon's armies. This good news produced the best effect on the garrison. It has seen that I had not flattered it with vain hopes, and the patience and courage it has shown have found the reward they were entitled to expect. The armistice has also been transmitted to me, and I write to your Highness particularly on this subject. I ought not to conceal that this suspension of arms, given the state of things, must be more disadvantageous than advantageous to the garrison, for disease still causes us a loss of 1,100 men per month, the consequence of which will be that by the 1st of August we shall have lost 1,700 men. Our provisions, moreover, will be consumed, and if the Duke of Württemberg does not show a better disposition towards us than he has done, we shall not be able to save, as otherwise we might have done, a portion of the provisions that he is bound to furnish us. Until the month of October, my situation will not cause me any uneasiness, but beyond that period it will become truly painful. We shall lack men to defend the immense range of our fortifications, provisions for the defenders, and we shall have no more to hope for from resources within or without. The account of the composition for the rations since the blockade will show your Highness that I have enforced, in the distribution of provisions, the strict economy our situation demanded, and that to this end I have employed all the resources available to me. But these resources are being exhausted, and it would be useless to rely on those which might be derived from the expulsion of the inhabitants. Indeed, to be convinced of this painful truth, one need only recall that 2 years ago Napoleon requisitioned 600,000 quintals of grain from the inhabitants of Danzig, an order which was rigorously carried out. At that time, only 23,000 quintals were left for the subsistence of the inhabitants. Since then, they have lived on this amount, and on some trifling portions which had been concealed from the strictest searches. I have already noted the monthly losses due to disease. The latest accounts of the state of the troops show an effective force of 20,558 men. According to estimates, only too accurate, already presented, this implies that by the end of the armistice, the garrison will be reduced to 20,000 men, from which must be deducted at least 2,000 who will be in hospitals. Even supposing that want does not increase the ravages of disease, what would our condition be, then, by the month of May, when the mortality implied by our current situation will have taken such a toll? It results from our calculations, assuming that winter diseases do not materially increase the number of deaths and allowing for a loss of 1,000 per month, that by the 1st of May, the total loss would be 8,000 men, not counting those who may perish in combat or from their wounds. By the month of May, there would remain an effective force of 11,000 men, of whom 3,000 would certainly be in hospitals. How is it possible to defend such extensive fortifications with so weak a garrison? I have already given orders for the construction of works intended to defend the entrance of the Motlau, an extremely weak point when the rivers are frozen. I am continuing with all that can secure my communications. But, I repeat, men are lacking for the defenses. Your Highness must not doubt that, if it becomes necessary, I will do everything that honor and my devotion to the Emperor suggest to maintain myself in some part of Danzig. The state of the magazines will prove to your Highness that our resources are very limited. You will, no doubt, believe that I shall manage them with all the care inspired by the desire to make an honorable defense. To this end, I have added to the commission for the management of provisions, which the law prescribes for places in a state of siege, a considerable number of members in addition to those required. I have placed them under the presidency of the General of Division, Count Houdelet. This commission is instructed to present to me all measures which may promote economy and the welfare of the soldiers. It has rendered great service, and I regret not having earlier invested it with the authority it now holds. The matter of finances merits very particular attention from the Emperor and your Highness. All the funds left at my disposal have been consumed, and I have been obliged to resort to a forced loan, which I imposed on all who were still able to contribute. This loan has been executed with great severity toward those who claimed inability to contribute to the common defense. But despite all the care taken and the various measures employed to obtain results, only 1,700,000 francs have been raised to date, and it will be difficult to levy the remainder. The expenses for the army's pay, those for engineering works, as well as those concerning manual labor, for all materials now in the place are taken, as has been the case for the past 2 months, by requisition to be paid for on demand when the blockade is lifted, the sums for artillery, for the hospitals, for the various branches of the service, for provisions, in short, for everything necessary for daily and manual labor, for marine constructions, clothing. All these expenses, for which I have ordered an estimate, amount to over 900,000 francs per month. A foreign commercial house has offered to provide funds here, provided the Paymaster General guarantees reimbursement in Paris. It would provide great peace of mind to see this matter settled, but I would prefer the funds to be sent directly to me, as otherwise some event might interrupt payment in the second month. Your Highness knows there is no way to do without prompt payment for all the aforementioned expenses, especially with a garrison composed as mine is. I therefore beseech you to request from His Majesty measures that ensure the payment of the sums I urgently need. I ought not to conclude without informing your Highness that the quantity of powder remaining in our magazines is not nearly in proportion to what would be necessary for a siege. To conclude, Monseigneur, I thought it right to make in advance all the observations that come to mind regarding the insufficiency of men for defense, the inadequacy of means of subsistence, the financial resources necessary to meet our expenses. In short, every supply situation relevant to our coming needs. I beseech your Highness to lay before the Emperor the painful situation in which we shall find ourselves if His Majesty does not come to our aid. What remains of the garrison is, in all other respects, excellent, and its loyalty may be relied upon, especially if a few well-placed rewards are granted for unlimited devotion. It will do all the Emperor can expect from his best soldiers, and will justify the confidence His Majesty has placed in it by counting it among the corps of his grand army. I am, etc. Signed, Count Rapp. The armistice was meanwhile approaching its termination. The troops, the ammunition, the artillery for the siege were arriving in abundance before the place. We soon had 300 pieces of cannon of large caliber and 60,000 fighting troops before us. The disproportion was immense. But we had conquered when enfeebled by disease, we might hope to conquer again. Nothing but the means of subsistence was wanting. The Russians were so convinced of this that they gave chase to the smallest craft which went fishing. Their gunboats even captured some of the craft which had not gone beyond the limits. I immediately dispatched a flag of truce to the admiral. I represented to him that the sea ought to be free for a league from the shore, and that I would know how to make the conditions of the armistice respected if they again attempted to infringe them. He promised to conform to the conditions and no longer to molest our boats. He did not, indeed, molest them, but that very evening he carried off our unfortunate fishermen, who had retired, unsuspecting, to their huts. He feared the abundance that a few pounds of fish might bring into the fortress. The peasants and the watercourses fared no better. The peasants were entrapped and the streams diverted. It appeared to them as though everything was moving to bring us food, as if sustenance were pouring in from all directions. It was in vain for me to protest. Indeed, there were never any shortage of pretenses or excuses. At last, Prince Wolkonsky announced to me the resumption of hostilities. I received this news with sincere satisfaction. Our relations had become too disagreeable for me not to desire their end. The enemy was full of confidence. He fought, he intrigued, he flattered himself with the hopes of taking the place by storm or reducing it to ashes. But through the vigilance and intrepidity of my soldiers, all his attempts failed. His incendiary rockets were wasted on our ramparts, his attacks were repulsed, and his emissaries discovered. Several of these wretches had already introduced themselves into our magazines, and were preparing to set them on fire. I perhaps ought to have made an example of them, but I dreaded lest this example might be dangerous. I feared that it would give a knowledge of the crime to those who were then ignorant of it, and that it would spread alarm amongst the troops. I pretended to believe that they had endeavored to pilfer some provisions, and I dismissed them. But I issued such severe proclamations against theft that I kept malevolence at a distance. After 3 days of humiliation and fatigue, the besiegers succeeded at last in getting possession of the wood of Ora. Driven from it almost immediately, they reappeared with new forces and drove in our detachment. The battalion on duty took arms a second time and rushed to its relief. Major Legros attacked the wood. 2 companies of grenadiers marched on the village. The troops met each other. They charged, they drove, they overthrew. The struggle became frightful. Captain Capgrau seized a Prussian officer by the hair. While he threw him to the ground, he himself was on the point of being killed. A soldier already touched him with his bayonet. Lieutenant Sabatier turned aside the blow, closed on the Cossack, and ran him through with his sabre. But at the moment he saved his chief, he received a wound in the throat which compelled him to quit the field of battle. In the wood, in the village, everywhere, the Russians were defeated. Captain Dusha killed 4 himself. Commandant Charton, Lieutenants Devrin and Blanchard mowed them down in heaps. A crowd of brave fellows rushed into the midst of them and increased the disorder. Francou, whose valor a short time afterwards was so famous, Martin, Couture, Rochette, Schlitz, Lepant, Benot, Soudet, Paris, Bellocchio, all sub-officers of the light troops, the carabinier Richida, the drummer Brequier, rushed even to the center of their columns and gave them up to the swords of our soldiers. Fresh troops took the place of those who were defeated and established themselves in the wood. Our heroes, led on by Lieutenant Joly de la Tour, rushed forward, attacked, and defeated them. The enemy, nevertheless, did not lose courage. They formed again into ranks and presented themselves a third time, but always overcome, always cut in pieces, they at last discontinued their attacks. Early the next day, the enemy threw themselves on Streis and Heiligenbrunn and took possession of Langfurt. Our advanced posts fell back on 2 blockhouses situated on the right and left of the village. The Russians pursued them and prepared to attack them, but the Poles fired on them with such rapidity and precision that they were forced to retreat. They returned in greater force. They covered. They inundated the defiles of the Jesch Kentel. They threatened Heiligenbrunn. They debouched by Streis. All my line was under fire. These maneuvers left no doubt as to their intentions. It was clear that they had serious views on Langfurt. I determined to anticipate them and march out to meet them. I assembled my troops, the left in the village, the center in the ravines of Ziegangenberg, and the right extending as far as Ora. 24 pieces of cannon, commanded by General Lepin, were placed in the middle between the 2 wings. They immediately commenced firing. The enemy's redoubts, his masses, his camp at Pitzkendorf, everything was ploughed up by our ball. We dismounted 2 of his pieces. The Poles, the Bavarians, the Westphalians, and 250 horse, commanded by General Farin, debouched at the same time. The brave Zembeck, already engaged with the Russians, was driving them from Duvelcome. As soon as our soldiers perceived this defeat, they grew warm and encouraged. They rushed on the redoubts at Pitzkendorf. The Allies, driven back on their works, endeavored in vain to defend themselves. Young Centurione, at the head of his hussars, overcame every obstacle but fell covered with wounds. At the sight of this excellent officer, carried off at so tender an age, the thirst for vengeance kindled the courage of our men. Infantry and cavalry poured pell-mell on the redoubts. The trumpeter Bernardin, the chasseur Ollier, the quartermaster Boucher threw themselves into the midst of the Russians. Lieutenant Thirion, already wounded, went straight to the officer who commanded them and took him prisoner. From that moment it was no longer a battle. It was slaughter. It was carnage. All perished at the point of the bayonet, or only owed their lives to the mercy of the conquerors. Whilst our soldiers were giving themselves up to the fire of their courage, a cloud of Cossacks rushed on them and threatened to cut them in pieces. But General Cavaignac moved up so promptly with the reserve of cavalry, the troops charged with such zeal, the commanding adjutant d'Héron, the chiefs of squadrons Bell and Zeluski, Captains Gibert, Fayot, Vallier, Pateski, and Bagatho displayed so much intelligence and skill that the enemy was completely routed and dispersed in the most frightful confusion. The cannonade grew warmer and warmer. The Russians still occupied the Johannisberg, the ground in front of Pitzkendorf, and made a furious attack on Langfurt. I detached against them a battalion of the Vistula, which was supported by the Neapolitans, commanded by General D'Etrées, having under his orders General Pepe, who has since been rendered so famous by the events which have occurred in his own country. The brave Zembeck commenced the attack. It was made with great regularity and impetuosity. The Russians, routed at the point of the bayonet, overthrown by destructive charges, sought safety by flight. The Poles pursued them with increased boldness. The drummer had seized one of them by the cartouche box, pulled him from the ranks, and disarmed him. Captain Fatzinski, forgetting that he was wounded, rushed into a house which they occupied, killed their chief, and made 30 of them prisoners. The Neapolitans were not less impetuous. They pressed forward in pursuit of the fugitives, drove them on, and fired upon them. General Pepe, Colonel Lebon, the commandants Balatier and Sourdais, Captains Chivandier and Cianculi directed and excited their courage, and gave at once both precept and example. On the opposite side of the mountain, the conflict was not less obstinate or bloody. At the appointed signal, Colonel Kaminsky had marched on the Russians and had dislodged them. He drove them before him. The pursuit was hot. Reinforcements arrived. Our adversaries endeavored to stem the torrent, but the Poles pursued them with impetuosity. Rozhezensky, Drabisklowski, Doks, Zaremba, Zignovich, followed by men devoted to their leaders, rushed on them and cut them in pieces. We were masters of Johannisberg. The weather was terrible. The enemy was flying at a distance. I ordered a retreat to be sounded. It was done in the most perfect order. At 6 o'clock, everything was tranquil. But the Russians were not long before they made their appearance again. They attacked at the same time the Belvedere and the heights of Heiligenbrunn. They kept up a very smart firing, but they were nevertheless unable to obtain the slightest advantage. Colonel Kaminsky and Commander Sembeck displayed a courage and skill which disconcerted them. They withdrew, but at the same time 2 battalions, supported by a numerous cavalry, marched on the village of Stries. Kaminsky rushed to its defense. The Russians returned immediately to the charge. They scaled the heights, they attacked the Belvedere, pushed on, and pressed their attacks. All their attempts failed against the excellent arrangements of Major Descor and the valor of the chiefs of Battalion Yeoman and Robieski. This was not the first diversion they had tried. They had already driven in our advanced posts from Schidlitz to Ora. Major Schneider, attacked in front and flank, only maintained this suburb by courage. He perceived a numerous column which imprudently entered the great broad street. He charged it, poured a shower of grape shot on it, and destroyed it. General Husson came up with the reserve. We resumed the offensive. In an instant, the wood and the village were taken, and the Russians thrown into dreadful confusion. The chief of Battalion Boulanger disarmed 8 of them. A sergeant who had been wounded by a musket ball, the brave Vestal, disarmed 3. The sub-officer Cornu rescued one of our men and took his escort prisoners. I was once more master of the Johannisberg and of Langfurt, but this success could not be durable. It was evident that the Russians, continually returning to the charge with fresh troops, must in the end succeed. Moreover, these 2 positions were so far separated from each other that they could neither injure me much nor be of much use to me. I gave, in consequence, orders to evacuate them if the Allies presented themselves in force. But their audacity had given place to timidity. They were afraid of removing from the heights. They dared not take possession of a village that had been abandoned. Impatient nevertheless to get possession of it, they engaged in a general action to make themselves masters of a post which I had resolved not to defend. The troops took arms. The fleet supported them. The whole of my line was attacked. 80 gunboats fired in concert and poured their shot on Neufahrwasser. Schellmühle, New Schottland, Ora, Zigangendorf became a prey to the flames. The enemy's troops spread themselves like a torrent in the plain. They overthrew or set fire to everything that opposed their passage. I came up in the midst of this terrible confusion, but already the courage of the Russians had declined. They were repulsed by a handful of brave men under the command of Major Poyek, and left the approaches of Cobrun filled with heaps of dead bodies. I gave orders to pursue them. The impetuous Gibert rushed forward with his chasseurs. Captain Maisonneuve joined him. They charged. The disorderly multitude was repulsed and driven back on Schellmühle. This party of the Russians, joined by the troops which occupied the village, received, without being broken, the destructive volleys of Captain Ostrowski. but almost immediately turned by Captain Marnier, one of the bravest officers in the French army, they fled, disbanded themselves, and sought for refuge amidst the ruins of buildings which they had given to the flames. That concludes the 14th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.